So a couple of days ago, I just recorded this quick 8 minute segment. And part of it is just because I really admire Dr. Andrew Huberman and his podcast. And I find that when I go through it, I get ideas. I get ideas about things that I'd want to do, my personal life, my professional life, things I'd want to do to help patients. And I just thought this one podcast was especially powerful due to his life story, due to some of the things he's done to help himself, and the stuff he's researching and sharing with the general public to help others. And I hope this segment inspires you to do a deeper dive into the podcast that I saw, and also into some of his other work that can probably help you personally, as I know it's definitely helped me. So I got up around, I don't know, it was like 6 a.m. today, and I just put on the TV and I was putting on a YouTube. I was just thinking, I need some positive energy. And I came across this Huberman Lab podcast that I might have seen maybe a year ago, I don't know. And it was really about hacking your motivational system. And I just I listened to it and I just thought it was very relevant to some of the addiction work that we do. And I thought like it would be great to just share a couple of ideas around it. I vaguely remember this podcast that I listened to maybe like a while back where it talked about how when you're in adulthood, there's about 3 ways to develop a purpose and meaning. One of the ways was just to try random things out and see what sticks. The other one is when someone goes through hardship, like a divorce or death or something like that. All of a sudden their mind starts thinking it differently. And the third way was imitation. And when I heard the person talk about that, it couldn't just be imitation. I felt like it had to be something more, right? Like it had to be like almost like admiration, and where you emulate and mimic and copy. The same way as a kid, you would take shots of basketball shots on the driveway, emulating Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan and so forth. And so for today, just this inspiration was this podcast. I'm basically going to talk about, what makes Huberman based on what he's shared. I'm going to share a bit about what his podcast is and what some of the key messages are. And most importantly, I'm going to share why it's relevant for addiction. And with Andrew Huberman, he's a neuroscientist. He originally did really like hardcore neuroscience work on vision, whereas his goal was help the blind see, and it's evolved quite a bit to motivation, human behavior, depression, all those kinds of things. And he's based at Stanford. And a couple of years back, he started this Huberman Lab podcast, and it's really 2 hours of just him speaking really intensely about self-improvement, behavior, motivation, depression, mental illness. And he does it in a very neuroscience basis, which is quite solid, And for myself, I think, when I was in undergrad, I always wanted to be a neuroscientist. My mom's older sister was a very successful scientist studying some kind of bacteria or... And so it was something where I did work in a neuroscience lab for a period of time. And so when you see someone who has that knowledge and is trying to inspire the world, it's really, it gets your mind going a bit. So in this podcast that we'll have the link below, he was interviewed by Rich Roll. It has like 12 million views. And it's the first time that I heard him talk about himself. He grew up in an environment where he had a physicist who was a father who was a scientist who had 2 labs, one at Stanford, one somewhere else. And growing up, he would constantly have these great scientists that would be over at dinner, and he'd learn about the people, he'd learn about the relationships, he'd go down to this Aspen Center and read books and things like that. And then around the time that he was 13, his father and his mom split up. His father went off to Europe somewhere to run a lab, and he had no connection. His mom really struggled with a very severe depression at that time. He was at a school that's like the school for the top prodigies, but also a school that had the most highest suicide rate in the country, called Gun High School. He was kicked out of that school, went to another school, kicked out of that school. And then something happened where they put him in some kind of facility where there was 12 people, and they sort of forced him to stay. And in that facility, someone told him that, well, if you want to get out of here, you have to do everything they tell you. You'll be out of there within a month. And then from the ages like 13 to like 18, 19, it was fascinating. He was very involved in the skateboarding community. And he talks about how the people there, a third of them ended up doing phenomenal things, starting their own business. A third of them just sort of did whatever. And a third of them were really struggling with mental illness and addiction as they got older. Also, during that time, he had a girlfriend that was very motivating for him. And he also I had a therapist that he was seeing. And so part of that treatment program we went, he had to see a therapist twice a week. And he was exposed to this Jon Kabat-Zinn book about where you are, there you go, or something along those lines, Introduction to Mindfulness. And he really felt such a strong connection with that therapist that he was seeing twice a week. And he found a way to do this mindfulness exercise for about 10 minutes a day. When his girlfriend went off to high school, he lived in some kind of parking lot across from her dorm. He didn't go to university for that year. And then what happened after that, after the breakup, he tried some martial arts, sports. Something happened where he decided that he needed to make use of his excellent memory, right, and try to learn something and become competent and successful. He had great mentors and supervisors. There's one PhD supervisor that was really well known at Stanford. He'd always smoke cigarettes in the lab and so forth. He had a very good friend die from suicide and a very good friend that struggles with schizophrenia. And he had to force himself to get motivated on things. So he had to force himself to sit, learn to focus, all of those kinds of things. And when you hear that story that's full of, what some people would call trauma, when some people would call perseverance, some people would call personal development and skill development around that time, you can almost see why it's so important for him to help others. And part of me wonders, what is it about him that made him so great? And he talks a lot about how fear has always been a big motivator. He talks a lot about different motivations in terms of goal setting, the mentors, all of those kinds of things. And it's really quite remarkable he's been able to do what he's done. His podcast is very much focused on self-development. A lot of the stories he'll share what he personally does to focus and motivate himself. He's very much inspired by greatness in some kind of way. And part of me wonders whether or not we would be so lucky to have someone like him had it not been for his father leaving for Europe when he was in his teens. When his father left for Europe, he was mainly raised by his mother, who had such a severe depression that he ended up in some kind of a facility. And just when I hear these kinds of things, his work pretty much combines the science of his father in terms of that skill set, and also awareness around the mental health issues that his mother dealt with and that his two friends with schizophrenia and suicide dealt with as well. And it's full of all these great things. One thing that's particularly relevant for addiction has to do with the dopamine state and neuroplasticity. He talks about how we have this belief that the brain is very plastic until the age of 25. And in his different podcasts, he'll give these definitions around what addiction is. He describes addiction as a progressive narrowing of things that give you a pleasure. And his podcast walk you through how to expand what that zone of pleasure is and what to add to that. He has a model of the world that starts with physical sensation, then it goes to perception, then emotions, then thoughts, then behavior. And he's very specific in how sometimes we make a mistake by focusing on our thoughts, when really for some people it's the behavior that causes that shift. And one thing that comes up when we talk about substance use is, what do you replace it with? What else do you put sort of in that? What do you put in its place? And how do you learn to build that focus? How do you learn to build those things? And he has these shortcuts that talk about epinephrine, noradrenaline, and acetylcholine, and dopamine. And he talks about how the acetylcholine is almost like the spotlight for focus. The dopamine comes from the meaning and the salience, and then the epinephrine is like that physical movement and activity. And there are these magic techniques that are based in neuroscience and psychological research that can allow you to maintain that motivation and focus for long periods of time. So, in summary, I think just it's just a podcast that I found very interesting. I find it fascinating, around figuring out and listening to the choices people make and what allows certain things to be important to them. And I feel very fortunate, though, even though Andrew Huberman or Dr. Huberman went through these horrible times in his teens, his life purpose seems to be very much related to solving these very difficult psychological problems using neuroscience, but also creating this entire database of all neuroscience and behavior knowledge available to the entire world for free. And it's just really great that we are in this day and age where we have access to people like his work and so forth. So I'll just leave it at that. And I hope you enjoy his podcast and his talks. I find all of them very interesting when I'm in that right state, and if it's a topic that captures my mind. And it's fascinating to hear and learn about how a research scientist who's very much focused on personal self-improvement puts all that knowledge together in a way that the general audience can take it up. So thank you.